I just read this Wired article by Jake Kleinman and I had to react. I think Kleinman is off base in many regards throughout this article. I do acknowledge that Star Wars is political, but its themes are universal and it doesn't date itself with being a direct allegory about modern politics. The Emperor and the Empire do heavily resemble the bad guys from World War II, but just because the Empire may have been modeled on something doesn't mean it is a direct allegory, nor does it mean that we should keep that in the forefront of our mind when watching Star Wars. If you are constantly thinking about modern politics or politics of the 20th century when watching Star Wars, then quite frankly, I feel bad for you because you're unable to escape and suspend disbelief and go into the galaxy far, far away. Because like J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle Earth, George Lucas's Galaxy Far, Far Away is not supposed to represent Earth or modern life. It's a fantasy story. Kleinman starts off on the wrong foot, saying on an isolated farm at the outer reaches of a fascist empire, a mid-level government toady interrogates his victims. Under the guise of conducting a government census, he's sniffing out undocumented immigrants. First of all, it is a government census, and it may have actually started years earlier than planned because of the events on Ferrix. Like many low-level people with a bit of power in an authoritarian regime, this guy is on the look for bribes, etc. But he's not looking for undocumented immigrants. He's specifically looking for people from Ferrix and other systems that are starting to rebel. Kleinman goes on to say when he finds one, he pounces, cornering a young migrant worker and attempting to coerce her into sleeping with him. When she refuses, he gets violent. Before this man was ever aware that Bix was undocumented, he intended on trying to assault her. When she mentioned a husband, he was very much interested in where the husband was, when he was coming back, because he wanted to get this woman alone. He was a predator who saw an opportunity in an isolated area to take advantage of a woman on her own. The fact that she was undocumented, he just attempted to use as leverage when he thought it would be advantageous. But he wasn't going to wait for consent. He was going to attack her one way or the other. Kleinman goes on to say it's a scene that feels familiar in America today where ICE agents are rounding up immigrants with disturbing impunity. But that metaphor doesn't hold. In this case, this is a tyrannical government that is trying to snuff out the beginning embers of the flames of rebellion. And it shows how evil people with a modicum of power can try to use that to abuse the vulnerable. Kleinman further gets it wrong when he says, if watching the new season of Andor makes you think of America's current lurch towards fascism, that's likely not a coincidence. In fact, it's arguably the point of Star Wars in the first place. Throughout the franchise's 47-year history, the Empire has served as a stand-in for everything from the United States during the Vietnam War to ancient Rome in the age of Julius Caesar. First of all, the Empire may have been inspired or aspects of it modeled after different things, but it has never been a stand-in for anything. It is not the Nazis. It is not ancient Rome. It is a universe of its own. And saying being a metaphor for these things or a stand-in for these things is the point of Star Wars, is to miss why Star Wars was created. George Lucas made those movies for children who would have no concept of Vietnam, no real access to what happened in ancient Rome. And to think that Star Wars is only political is beyond stupid. It is a tale of family, betrayal, revenge, friendship, power dynamics, yes, politics, religion, and ultimately the battle between good and evil. I think Kleinman is seeing Star Wars in too simplistic of terms and missing out on the complexity, the adventure, and the heart of the story. Then, of course, he quotes Chris Hempshaw, a historian and author of the history of politics in Star Wars, and kind of contradicts himself. The historian says the Empire is both incredibly stable adaptable and incredibly flexible as an entity to hang metaphors on, which implies that it wasn't necessarily created as a metaphor or as a stand-in for something, but that it is something that we can look at and see similarities, create our own metaphors. But Kempsall then says the details of the empire have changed a lot over time to adapt to these changes in real-world politics. I would argue that that's incorrect too. The details of the empire have not really changed. It's always been a fascist entity. The structure of the empire has maintained consistency, with the emperor being at the top, having his evil henchmen like Darth Vader below him, as well as bureaucrats like Governor Tarkin, and then even allowing an appearance of democracy with the Senate up until A New Hope. I'm not sure what details he's referring to that have changed to reflect modern politics. Going further into the article, Kleinman says, in general, the sequel trilogy is too busy wrestling with the meaning of Star Wars itself to say anything potent about American politics. I would say the sequel trilogy was not wrestling with the meaning of Star Wars itself. It was wrestling with an inability to maintain consistency of story from changing directors and writers. Kleinman then, of course, does the obvious and bring up the Acolyte and blame a small, loud, toxic fandom determined to drag the franchise to the right both politically and culturally for the Acolyte's failure, which is quite frankly the most lazy narrative known to man. Just blame the fans rather than the fact that the show broke canon, suffered from bad writing, bad acting, and a series of annoying and condescending interviews from those involved with the show. People didn't like the show and they chose not to watch it. Or if they did watch it, they chose to say they didn't like it. That doesn't mean people are toxic. And it certainly doesn't mean it's because of people trying to push Star Wars to the right politically. Kleinman, of course, then goes on about how Andor is now Lucas's most blatant attempt to get back to the type of biting political commentary that defined its pre-Disney era. Yet again, this is about the beginning of a rebellion against a tyrannical empire. It's got political elements, but the show isn't just a biting political commentary. And if that's all you can get out of it, I really do feel sorry for you. Of course, then he has to bring up that Americans view that our democracy is crumbling. Then it goes back to the situation with Bix on Mina Rao, especially their worry that they're going to check visas, which yet again she's worrying about because she's a rebel and was part of the insurgency on Ferrix. Kleinman references the farmer who supposedly turned the rebels in, one that Brasso yells at, saying that the farmer serves as a reminder of just how difficult it can be to resist an authoritarian power. I think Kleinman is missing out on something in this scene. Brasso yells at the farmer that he betrayed them, but I don't think that the farmer actually betrayed them. I think Brasso yells at him specifically to say to the Imperial agents that this farmer had nothing to do with hiding them and that he is not culpable and therefore should not be punished. Brasso was trying to protect a friend who had helped shelter them. Kleinman goes on to reference the Star Wars historian Kempsall again, who says that Andor's greatest innovation is the way it exposes grassroots elements of fascism. I would argue, though, that Andor is only expanding on the bureaucracy related to fascism, not really the grassroots elements of fascism that made the evil possible in the first place, because the Emperor is the reason the Empire happened. However, he took advantage of elements in the Republic that were already existing. The prequels really showed the foundations for the Empire and how it used the mundane as well as trade, treaties, etc. to destroy the foundations of the Republic and build up the fascist empire and give the Emperor ultimate power. I think Andor's actual greatest innovation is showing the grassroots efforts of rebellion, of people people under the thumb of authoritarianism who are yearning for more control over their own lives. Then Kleinman goes on to discuss how Star Wars is basically Vietnam and the rebellion is the Viet Cong. It's unclear if he's referencing Kempshaw at this point or if these are ideas that are just Kleinman's. But yeah, I'd hazard a guess that next to no one looks at the rebellion and thinks, oh yeah, that's the Viet Cong, a ragtag group of rebels engaging in guerrilla warfare to fight against evil. Where does that sound familiar? Oh, well, yes, the American Revolution, World War II with the French Resistance, etc. It's a much more universal concept that's used in other sci-fi properties and isn't a direct metaphor to anything specific. Then Kleinman goes further into the prequel series and how it's a metaphor for the policies and wars engaged in by President George Bush. Yet again, almost no one looks at the prequels and thinks, that's George Bush era United States politics and conflicts. I really feel sorry for these people who seem to have no imagination and ability to suspend disbelief and any awareness that this is a sci-fi program, sci-fi property that was originally intended for children. I also really do not think that Anakin saying, if you're not with me, you're my enemy, was an unsubtle reference to the Iraq War compared to Bush's post 9/11 threat, either you're with us or you are with the terrorists. Anakin's thinking at that point was binary. Either you agreed with him 100% or you were his enemy. It was because he had succumbed to the dark side, not because of American politics. And it's kind of nasty to compare George W. Bush with Anakin Skywalker when it comes to a relationship with the 9/11 terrorists. Anakin Skywalker was not on the right side of history with his actions. He slaughtered children. George W. Bush did not slaughter children, but the 9/11 terrorists slaughtered thousands and would have killed more had they had the chance. I really feel this article should have been entitled, I Hate America, and why Star Wars supports my belief in hating America. I would urge anyone who just constantly is thinking about modern politics when watching Star Wars to step back, take a deep breath, and get a life. Not everything is an allegory. We do not need to tie everything to modern times. And sometimes we can just appreciate universal themes and a great story. Enjoy Star Wars for what it is and the fictional universe it inhabits. And appreciate Andor for the story it's telling, not its supposed links to modern politics and geopolitical activities. Thank you for anyone who stuck it out to the end of the video. Let me know what you think in the comments.